"Clean it yourself," he said, smiling like the room belonged to him. The laughter came a second later, soft at first, then spreading like something rehearsed, glasses clinking, heels shifting against polished marble, the kind of laughter that didn't need permission because it had never been denied anything in its life. Ava Johnson didn't move right away. The frosting was cool against her cheek, sliding slowly along her jawline, carrying the faint scent of sugar and vanilla that didn't belong in a room like this, a room filled with tailored suits, low jazz humming beneath conversations worth millions, and chandeliers that cast light like judgment. She stood there in it, the silence inside her louder than the noise around her, her breath steady, controlled, as if she had practiced this moment before, as if somewhere along the way she had learned that reacting too quickly cost more than dignity. Across from her, Ethan Whitmore leaned back slightly, one hand still holding the edge of the dessert plate, his expression somewhere between amusement and curiosity, like he was waiting to see what kind of scene she would make, like this was entertainment he had paid for. To his right, Claire Whitmore lifted her glass, hiding a smile that didn't quite disappear, while Richard Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks, eyes briefly scanning the room before settling somewhere safely neutral, not intervening, not correcting, not seeing. The music didn't stop. No one called it out. A server nearby hesitated, fingers tightening around a silver tray, eyes flickering toward Ava and then away just as quickly, trained instinct overriding something more human. Ava reached up slowly, not rushed, not embarrassed, just deliberate, her fingers brushing the frosting from her skin, leaving a faint streak across her palm. She didn't wipe it on her dress. She didn't look for a napkin. She simply held it there for a moment, as if measuring something invisible, something heavier than the room could understand. Her eyes lifted then, not sharp, not angry, just clear, landing on Ethan with a calm that didn't match the situation, and for a fraction of a second, something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptible, like a note slightly off key. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice even, quiet enough that it didn't compete with the music, but precise enough that it reached him anyway. The question hung there, not challenging, not submissive, just placed, like a line drawn without needing to be seen. Ethan let out a short laugh, glancing briefly at his parents before shrugging, as if to say it wasn't that serious, as if the moment didn't carry weight beyond the surface. "Relax," he said, waving a hand loosely. "It's just a joke." Another ripple of laughter followed, thinner this time, less certain, but still present, still safe. Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if filing something away. She stepped slightly to the side, her heels making a soft sound against the floor, and reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, her movements unhurried, controlled, almost detached from the energy that had just passed through her. The cold glass pressed against her fingers, grounding, real. She took a small sip, then set it down with the same care, her reflection briefly catching in the mirrored surface behind the bar, a woman composed, precise, untouched in ways that couldn't be seen. Conversations began to resume around her, the room eager to smooth itself over, to pretend nothing had happened, because that was easier, because that was how power protected itself. Claire leaned toward Richard, whispering something that drew a faint smirk, while Ethan checked his phone, already drifting past the moment, already bored. Ava turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the details others ignored, the placement of logos, the arrangement of seating, the quiet hierarchy embedded in every corner. Her eyes paused, just briefly, on the long table near the center, where a set of documents rested beneath a subtle spotlight, crisp pages aligned with deliberate care, the kind of presentation reserved for decisions that shaped companies' futures, reputations. She looked at it not with excitement, not with urgency, but with a stillness that suggested familiarity, as if this, not the laughter, was the real center of the night. A server approached cautiously, offering a fresh napkin, and Ava accepted it with a small nod, wiping the last trace of frosting from her hand, leaving nothing behind but clean skin and quiet control. Somewhere behind her, Ethan's voice rose again, light, careless, already telling a different story, already rewriting the moment into something harmless. Ava didn't turn back. She adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, the fabric smooth beneath her fingertips, and took a step toward the center of the room. toward the table, toward the documents no one had yet touched. And that's when someone finally noticed where she was walking. The shift was subtle at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm, the kind you only notice if you are paying attention, and for a moment, almost no one was. Ava Johnson moved with quiet certainty, her heels measured against the marble floor, each step controlled, unhurried, as if the room had already adjusted to her pace, even if the people in it had not. The table ahead was set apart from everything else, not by distance but by intention, a long stretch of dark wood beneath soft overhead lighting, documents arranged in perfect alignment, pins placed with deliberate symmetry, the silent center of a night built on expectations no one had questioned. A man in a tailored navy suit, one of the event coordinators, noticed her approach and straightened instinctively, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert in a single breath. "Ma'am," he said quietly, stepping forward, his voice respectful but cautious, as if unsure whether she belonged in that space or was about to be redirected away from it. Ava stopped just short of the table, her gaze moving over the documents, not scanning, not curious, but familiar, like someone revisiting something already decided. "Is everything ready?" she asked, her tone calm, steady, without hesitation. The coordinator blinked, caught off guard not by the question itself, but by the certainty behind it, the absence of doubt. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, almost automatically, then added, "We are just waiting for the Whitmore family to join." Ava gave a slight nod, the kind that did not seek confirmation because it did not need it, and reached out, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the top document, not opening it, not moving it, just touching it as if to confirm its presence. Behind her, the room continued its quiet performance, laughter rebuilding in softer tones, conversations returning to safe topics, the earlier moment already dissolving into something easier to ignore. Ethan Whitmore was still near the bar, his attention now divided between his phone and a small group that had gathered around him, his earlier amusement fading into casual distraction. Claire stood beside him, speaking to a woman in a silver dress, her expression composed, controlled, as if nothing out of place had occurred, while Richard Whitmore spoke with a pair of investors near the windows, his voice low, confident, the rhythm of someone used to being listened to. None of them had turned toward the table yet. None of them had noticed Ava standing there. A server passed behind her, the faint scent of citrus and polished glass trailing in the air, and for a brief moment, Ava closed her eyes, not in fatigue, not in hesitation, but in something quieter, something like alignment, as if she were placing herself exactly where she needed to be before everything else caught up. When she opened them again, her expression had not changed, but something in her stillness had deepened, settled into place. The coordinator shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward the Whitmores, then back at Ava, a flicker of realization beginning to form, not fully understood yet, but present. "Would you like me to inform them you are ready?" he asked, his voice lower now, more careful. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the pen resting beside the documents, turning it slowly between her fingers, the metal catching the light in brief, controlled flashes. It was a simple pen, elegant, precise, the kind chosen not for show but for function, for decisions that carried weight beyond the page. She placed it back exactly where it had been, aligned perfectly with the edge of the paper, then looked up, her gaze moving past the coordinator, across the room, landing briefly on Ethan, who was mid-sentence, mid-laugh, unaware of the shift already taking shape around him. "No," she said softly. "They will come." The coordinator nodded, stepping back without another word, something in his posture now unmistakably deferential, as if a line had been drawn that he could not yet see but could already feel. A few feet away, a young server paused, her eyes lingering on Ava just a second longer than appropriate, recognition flickering in a way that did not come from status, but from something more personal, something unspoken. Ava noticed, just barely, and gave the smallest nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed entirely, but it was enough. The music shifted slightly, the tempo slowing, the notes stretching longer between beats, and for the first time that evening, the room did not feel entirely in control of itself. Conversations hesitated, glances redirected, attention beginning to drift toward the table, toward the space Ava now occupied without asking permission. Richard Whitmore was the first to turn fully, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he took in the scene, the coordinator's posture, the arrangement of the table, and finally, Ava standing at its center. Claire followed his gaze, her expression tightening in a way that did not quite reach concern but moved past comfort, while Ethan, still half turned away, continued speaking for another second too long before sensing the shift behind him. Ava did not move. She did not call out. She simply stood there, her presence steady, unyielding, as if the night had been building toward this exact moment long before anyone else realized it. And then Richard started walking toward her. Richard Whitmore did not rush, but there was a precision to his stride now, the kind that came from decades of walking into rooms where outcomes were expected to bend toward him, his shoulders squared, his expression composed in that carefully neutral way that signaled control rather than curiosity. As he approached the table, the conversations behind him softened, not silenced, but lowered just enough to make space for whatever this moment was becoming. Claire followed a step behind, her heels clicking lightly, her posture still elegant but no longer entirely relaxed, while Ethan lingered further back, slower to move, his earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of uncertainty he could not quite name. Ava remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady, meeting Richard's as he came to a stop across from her, the table now a quiet line between them. For a brief second, neither of them spoke, the kind of pause that did not feel awkward but deliberate, as if both understood that whatever was said next would define more than just the evening. Richard glanced down at the documents, then back up at Ava, his eyes narrowing just slightly, recalibrating, reassessing. "I was not aware you were handling this directly," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, carrying the faint edge of someone adjusting to unexpected information without admitting surprise. Ava did not react to the implication, did not correct the tone, did not soften it either. "I am," she replied simply, her voice even, giving nothing away beyond the statement itself. Claire stepped closer, her gaze moving quickly between Ava and the documents, a small crease forming at the corner of her eyes, the first visible sign that something was not aligning with her expectations. "We were told the board would be present," she said, her tone polite but probing, as if testing the structure of the situation, looking for something familiar to hold on to. Ava nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement. "They are," she said, then added, "through me." The words landed quietly, without emphasis, but they carried weight, settling into the space between them in a way that shifted the air just enough to be felt. Ethan, now closer, let out a short, uncertain laugh, glancing at his parents as if expecting them to dismiss the moment, to restore the balance he was used to. "Wait, so you are what? The spokesperson?" he said, his tone light, but edged with something less stable than before. Ava turned her head slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her gaze calm, direct. "No," she said. "I am the final decision." The sentence did not rise in volume, did not demand attention, but it pulled it anyway, the surrounding room responding in small, almost invisible ways, a pause in movement here, a glance redirected there, as if the gravity of the moment was beginning to register even before it was fully understood. Richard's posture shifted, just a fraction, his shoulders tightening before settling again, his eyes returning to the documents with a new kind of focus, one that carried calculation rather than assumption. "I see," he said, though the words felt less like confirmation and more like adjustment, like a man rewriting a script in real time. Claire's smile had faded now, replaced by something more careful, more measured, her hands clasping lightly in front of her as she studied Ava with a different kind of attention, one that no longer dismissed. Ethan said nothing this time, his gaze moving from Ava to the table, then back again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person that no longer matched. Ava reached for the top document, opening it with a smooth, unhurried motion, the soft sound of paper shifting echoing slightly in the space that had grown quieter around them. She did not immediately look down. Instead, she let the document rest open, her hand placed lightly on the page, her presence anchoring the moment. "We can begin whenever you are ready," she said, her tone steady, offering control without asking for it. Richard inhaled slowly, then nodded, stepping closer to the table, his movements now more deliberate, less automatic, as if each action required a fraction more thought than before. Claire moved beside him, her eyes scanning the document, her earlier ease replaced by a focus that bordered on tension. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, then stepped forward as well, drawn in despite himself, his earlier laughter now entirely gone. Around them, the room had shifted fully, the hum of conversation reduced to a low murmur, attention quietly converging on the table, on the people standing at its center, on the moment that had somehow taken shape without announcement. Ava finally lowered her gaze to the document, her eyes moving across the page with practiced familiarity, not reading for the first time, but confirming what she already knew, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. The pen rested just inches away, aligned perfectly, waiting, and Ethan began to understand something he should have seen earlier. The realization did not arrive all at once for Ethan. It crept in through small fractures in the moment, through the way his father was no longer speaking first, through the way his mother's eyes kept returning to Ava instead of the room, through the way the staff had subtly shifted their attention toward her without being told. He stood just behind his parents now, close enough to hear the soft turn of pages, the faint brush of fabric as Claire adjusted her stance, the controlled inhale Richard took before leaning slightly over the document. The room felt different here, quieter, heavier, as if the air near the table carried more consequence than the rest of the ballroom. Ava's hand rested lightly against the paper, her fingers still, her posture unchanged, the earlier moment with the cake now completely absent from her presence, as if it had never touched her at all. Richard cleared his throat softly, a habit more than a necessity, his eyes scanning the first page with practiced efficiency. But there was a pause now, a fraction longer than usual, a sign that he was not simply confirming details, he was recalculating. These terms, he said slowly, his voice measured, are more restrictive than we discussed. Ava did not look up immediately. She let the silence hold for a second, then another, before lifting her gaze, meeting his with the same calm steadiness. They reflect what we require, she said, her tone even, not defensive, not negotiable, just clear. Claire leaned in slightly, her voice softer but edged with concern. We were under the impression this was a partnership, she said, choosing her words carefully, as if each one needed to land correctly. Ava nodded once. It is, she replied, then added, a structured one. Ethan shifted his weight, his hands sliding into his pockets, then out again, unsure where to place them, his earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet discomfort that had no easy outlet. He glanced at the document, but did not step closer, as if something about it now felt less accessible to him. Around them, a few guests had begun to drift nearer, not enough to crowd the space, but enough to observe, their conversations lowering into whispers, curiosity replacing indifference. Richard turned a page, his jaw tightening slightly, the controlled expression he had maintained beginning to show strain at the edges. 70% oversight on operational decisions, he read, almost to himself, then looked up. That was not part of the original discussion. Ava's expression did not change. It is now, she said, the words simple, unadorned, leaving no room for reinterpretation. Claire exhaled quietly, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. This is a significant shift, she said. It changes the balance entirely. Ava's gaze moved briefly to her, acknowledging the statement without softening it. It clarifies the balance, she replied. Ethan let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor, his voice lower now, less certain. So this is what, a takeover disguised as a deal? He said, looking directly at Ava for the first time since the earlier moment, his tone attempting confidence, but landing somewhere closer to confusion. Ava met his gaze, steady, unflinching. It is an agreement, she said. One you are free to decline. The simplicity of it landed harder than any raised voice could have, the absence of pressure revealing the actual weight of the choice. Richard straightened slightly, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the document, his mind clearly moving through possibilities, outcomes, risks. We have invested considerable time into this negotiation, he said, his tone tightening, not aggressive, but no longer entirely smooth. Adjustments of this scale require discussion. Ava inclined her head just slightly. That is what we are doing, she said. Claire's gaze flickered toward Ethan for a brief moment, something unspoken passing between them, then returned to Ava. There must be some flexibility, she said, her voice controlled but carrying a note that had not been there before. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the pen again, lifting it with the same measured precision, turning it once between her fingers before setting it back down in its exact place. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it drew attention, a quiet reminder of what came next, of what this moment was leading toward. Ethan watched the movement, his eyes narrowing slightly, a realization forming more clearly now, not just about the deal, but about the position Ava held within it, about the control she had never announced but had always possessed. The earlier laughter felt distant now, misplaced, like something that had belonged to a different room entirely. Ava finally looked down at the document again, her eyes moving across the lines with calm familiarity, then back up at Richard and Claire, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. Take your time, she said softly. We are in no hurry. The words settled into the space with quiet authority, shifting the pressure entirely, placing it not on her, but on them. Richard exchanged a brief glance with Claire, the kind that carried years of shared decisions, of silent communication, but this time, there was hesitation, a fraction of uncertainty that had not been there before. Ethan looked between them, then back at Ava, his posture no longer relaxed, his earlier ease replaced by something sharper, more aware. And for the first time that evening, he stopped smiling. The silence stretched longer than anyone in the room was comfortable with, not loud, not dramatic, just present in a way that made every small movement feel amplified. The faint clink of glass, the subtle shift of fabric, the quiet hum of the music now sounding distant, almost irrelevant. Ava did not rush to fill it. She stood with the same calm precision, her hand resting near the document, her posture unchanging, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace. Across from her, Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly through his nose, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself in something physical while his mind worked through the implications. That had become impossible to ignore. Claire's gaze moved once more across the page, but this time she was not searching for details. She was searching for leverage, for something that could restore the balance she had assumed was theirs from the beginning. Ethan remained just behind them, close enough to hear every word, far enough to feel removed from the control he had always taken for granted, his eyes shifting between Ava and the contract, then briefly down to his own reflection in the polished surface of the table, as if trying to recognize the version of himself that had existed only minutes earlier. We should step aside for a moment, Claire said quietly, her voice composed but no longer effortless, her hand lightly touching Richard's arm in a gesture that was both subtle and urgent. Richard nodded once, not looking away from Ava immediately, holding her gaze for a fraction longer, as if measuring something he could not yet define, then stepping back with Claire just a few feet away, their voices lowering into a controlled whisper that still carried the weight of urgency beneath it. Ava did not follow them with her eyes. She remained where she was, her attention returning to the document, her fingers adjusting the edge of the paper by a fraction of an inch, aligning it perfectly with the table, a small act of order in a moment that had begun to unravel for others. A server approached quietly, placing a fresh glass of water near her, the condensation forming along the surface, catching the light in soft reflections. Ava acknowledged it with a slight nod, but did not reach for it. Nearby, the young server from earlier lingered just at the edge of the scene, her posture attentive, her eyes occasionally lifting toward Ava with a quiet recognition that did not need explanation. The room had shifted fully now, the earlier ease replaced by a low current of anticipation, conversations reduced to murmurs, attention no longer scattered but focused, drawn toward the table where something unspoken was unfolding. Ethan took a small step closer, his hands now still at his sides, his gaze fixed on Ava in a way that was no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but searching, trying to understand how the moment had turned without him noticing, how the person he had reduced to a joke now stood at the center of something he could not control. He glanced toward his parents, their whispered exchange growing more intense, their composure holding but strained, then back at Ava, whose stillness seemed to anchor the entire room. Richard and Claire returned after a few moments, their expressions reset but not restored, the edges of their confidence now carefully managed rather than assumed. Richard stepped forward again, his voice measured, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "We are willing to proceed," he said, choosing each word with precision, "but these terms will require adjustments." Ava looked up at him, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, as if she had already anticipated the statement. "Which ones?" she asked, her tone calm, not confrontational, simply direct. Claire stepped in slightly, her voice softer but firm. "Operational oversight, primarily," she said. "We need a more balanced structure." Ava held her gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I understand," she said. She paused, just long enough for the expectation of compromise to begin forming, then added, "That is not something we are offering." The words landed without force, without emphasis, but they carried a finality that settled into the space, like something immovable. Ethan felt it before he fully understood it, a shift that made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if the options that had once seemed endless were now narrowing in real time. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table before stilling, a sign of restraint more than frustration. "Then we may need to reconsider the structure of this entire agreement," he said, his tone controlled but edged now, the first clear indication that the conversation was no longer unfolding on his terms. Ava inclined her head slightly, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "You are free to do that," she replied. No hesitation, no urgency, just permission, the kind that revealed where the real leverage had always been. Claire's composure flickered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she studied Ava, as if searching for something beneath the surface, something that might explain the certainty, the calm, the complete absence of doubt. Ethan looked at Ava again, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her presence in the room, but at the way she held herself, the way she spoke, the way she did not need to raise her voice to shift everything around her. And in that moment, the memory of what he had done earlier did not disappear. It sharpened, taking on a different weight, a different meaning. Ava reached for the pen once more, her fingers closing around it with quiet precision, lifting it just slightly above the page, not yet touching paper, not yet making a mark. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. And then she paused. The pen hovered just above the paper, close enough to cast a thin shadow across the signature line, but not touching, not committing, not moving forward. And in that stillness, something deeper than hesitation settled into the room. Ava's fingers held it lightly, not tense, not uncertain, simply paused, as if the decision had already been made somewhere else, and this moment was only waiting to catch up. Across from her, Richard Whitmore watched with a focus that had sharpened into something almost rigid, his earlier composure now held together by discipline rather than ease, his eyes fixed on the exact point where ink would meet paper. Claire stood beside him, her posture straight, her hands clasped just tightly enough to reveal the strain beneath her calm, her gaze flickering once between Ava's hand and the document, as if measuring the distance between what they wanted and what they might lose. Ethan stood slightly behind them, but closer than before, drawn forward by something he did not fully understand, his attention locked on the pen, on the space between action and restraint, on the moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Ava did not look at the document now. Instead, her eyes lifted slowly, moving past the signatures, past the numbers, past the structured language of agreement, and settled briefly on the room around her, taking in the faces that had gathered, the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet anticipation that had replaced earlier indifference. For a fraction of a second, her gaze landed on the young server standing near the edge of the space, the same one who had hesitated earlier, her eyes wide, attentive, her expression carrying something unspoken but unmistakable. Ava held that gaze just long enough to acknowledge it, not with a smile, not with reassurance, but with recognition, something deeper than either, something that did not need to be explained. Then she looked back at the table. The pen remained suspended, unchanged, But the meaning of the pause had begun to shift, no longer about timing, no longer about negotiation, but about choice. Richard cleared his throat again, softer this time, less a signal of control and more a reflex against the weight of the silence. "If there are final considerations," he said, his voice measured but quieter than before, "we can address them now." Ava did not respond immediately. She lowered the pen just slightly, close enough that the tip nearly touched the page, then stopped again, the movement precise, controlled, intentional. "There are," she said finally, her voice calm, steady, carrying no trace of the tension that had begun to settle over the others. Claire leaned in just a fraction, her attention sharpening. "Then let us discuss them," she said, her tone composed, but edged with urgency she could no longer fully conceal. Ava placed the pen back on the table, aligning it carefully beside the document. The soft click of metal against wood barely audible, but enough to mark the end of one expectation and the beginning of something else. She rested her hand lightly against the paper, not holding it, not claiming it, just present. "This partnership," she said, her words measured, deliberate, "is not only about numbers." Richard's expression tightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he listened, aware now that the conversation had moved beyond terms and percentages into something less predictable. "We agree," he said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely certain where the statement would lead. Ava nodded once, acknowledging the agreement without softening what followed. "It is also about alignment," she continued, her gaze steady, moving briefly between Richard and Claire before settling again. "About how people are treated. In every room. At every level." The words did not rise in volume, did not accuse, did not point, but they landed with a clarity that left little room for misunderstanding. Claire's composure flickered again, just for a moment, her eyes shifting slightly, as if recalling something she would have preferred to leave behind. Richard remained still, his jaw set, his focus unwavering, but something in his posture suggested he understood more than he was willing to acknowledge. Ethan felt it differently, more directly, the connection forming in his mind not as a concept, but as a realization. A line drawn backward to a moment he had dismissed, now returning with weight. Ava did not look at him. She did not need to. "We do not separate conduct from collaboration," she said, her tone unchanged, her words steady, each one placed with intention. "They are the same." The room seemed to quiet further, as if even the background noise had receded in response, leaving only the space between her words and their meaning. Richard exhaled slowly, his eyes lowering briefly to the document, then lifting again, his expression now carrying something more complex than control, something closer to recognition. Claire's hands relaxed slightly, though her posture remained tense, her gaze fixed on Ava with a new kind of attention, one that no longer questioned her authority, but something else entirely. Ethan swallowed, the movement small but visible, his earlier ease completely gone, replaced by an awareness that felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Ava's hand remained resting near the document, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, but the center of the moment had shifted entirely, no longer about whether the deal would be signed, but about what it meant to deserve it. And that is when Richard looked at his son. Richard did not speak right away, but the look he gave Ethan carried more weight than anything he could have said out loud. Not anger, not even disappointment, but a quiet, unmistakable expectation that settled like pressure in the space between them. Ethan felt it immediately, the shift in his father's attention no longer directed at the deal, not at Ava, but at him, and for the first time that night, he did not know where to look. His instinct was to deflect, to shrug it off, to turn the moment into something lighter, something forgettable, but the room did not allow for that anymore. The air too still, too aware, too focused on what had already happened. Claire noticed it too, her gaze moving from Richard to Ethan, her expression tightening slightly, not surprised, but no longer able to ignore the connection Ava had just drawn without ever naming it directly. Ava remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly near the document, her presence steady, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said, and was now simply allowing the truth of it to settle on its own. Ethan shifted his weight, his hands moving again without purpose, his eyes briefly dropping to the table, then lifting again, but not quite meeting anyone's gaze. "What?" he said finally, his voice quieter than before, lacking the ease it had carried earlier, the word hanging there, thin, uncertain. Richard held his gaze, unblinking, the silence stretching just long enough to make the question feel smaller than it sounded. "You heard her," Richard said at last, his tone controlled, low, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. Ethan let out a short breath, almost defensive, almost dismissive, but it did not fully form. "It was just a joke," he said, the same words from earlier, but now they sounded different, less certain, as if even he did not fully believe them anymore. No one laughed this time. Claire's eyes flickered briefly, then settled on Ethan with a look that was more measured than supportive, as if she were choosing not to step in, not to smooth it over. Ava did not react outwardly. She did not interrupt, did not correct him, did not even look at him directly, but the stillness around her seemed to sharpen, the absence of response making his words feel heavier than if she had challenged them. Richard exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly. "That is not the point," he said, each word deliberate, placed with care. Ethan frowned, confusion mixing with something else, something less comfortable. "Then what is?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain, the question no longer rhetorical. For a moment, no one answered. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like tension and more like something being revealed in real time. Ava's gaze shifted then, not abruptly, not confrontational, but intentional, finally settling on Ethan, meeting his eyes with the same calm steadiness she had held all evening. There was no anger there, no accusation, just clarity, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. "It is never just a joke," she said softly. The words were simple, almost quiet, but they landed with a precision that cut through the space more cleanly than anything louder could have. Ethan blinked, his expression tightening, something in his posture shifting again, the edges of his confidence giving way to something more exposed. He looked at her, really looked this time. Not at her position, not at the situation, but at her as a person standing in front of him, someone he had reduced to a moment that now refused to stay small. Ava held his gaze for a second longer, then let it go, returning her attention to the table, to the document, to the space where decisions were made, not reactions. The room remained quiet, the earlier energy completely gone, replaced by something steadier, heavier, more honest. Claire glanced at Richard again, her expression now fully serious, the last trace of earlier amusement gone. Richard nodded once, a small, controlled movement, then looked back at Ethan, the expectation in his gaze unchanged. Ethan swallowed, the movement visible, his throat tightening slightly, his mind working through something he had not been prepared to face, something that did not come with an easy response or a quick escape. His eyes dropped briefly to the table, to the document, to the pen resting beside it, then lifted again, slower this time, more deliberate. Ava's hand remained still near the paper, her presence unchanged, but the center of the moment had shifted again, no longer about her position, no longer about the deal itself, but about something more personal, more immediate, something that could not be negotiated away. Ethan opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, the words not forming as easily as they once had, the space between impulse and action now filled with something unfamiliar. And for the first time that night, he hesitated before speaking. Ethan's breath came in quieter now, less certain, his chest rising and falling as if the room had grown smaller around him, as if the space he had always moved through without resistance was now pressing back. He looked at Ava again, his eyes searching for something he could hold on to, something familiar, something that would let him return to the version of himself that had existed just minutes ago, but there was nothing in her expression that offered that. She did not look angry. She did not look offended. She looked steady, and somehow that made it harder. "I did not mean anything by it," he said finally, his voice lower, stripped of the casual confidence it once carried, the words sounding more like an explanation than a defense. The sentence hung there, thin, incomplete, and no one rushed to catch it. Ava did not respond right away. She let the silence sit between them, not to punish him, not to prolong discomfort, but to allow the weight of what he had said to exist without being softened or dismissed. Around them, the room remained quiet, The earlier conversations now fully dissolved into attentive stillness, the soft music barely noticeable beneath the tension that had settled like a second atmosphere. Claire shifted slightly, her hand brushing lightly against Richard's sleeve, a subtle gesture, not to intervene, but to acknowledge that something real was unfolding, something that could not be managed with a polite redirect. Richard remained still, his gaze moving between Ethan and Ava, his expression controlled but no longer distant, as if he were witnessing something he had not expected to matter this much. Ava's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the document, her touch grounding, present, her posture unchanged. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying no sharpness, no accusation. "That is usually how it begins," she said. Ethan blinked, his brow tightening slightly, the meaning not immediately clear, but not dismissible either. "What is?" he asked, quieter now, his tone no longer defensive, but searching, uncertain. Ava's gaze held his for a moment, steady, unflinching. "Something small," she said. "Something that feels easy to ignore." Her words moved slowly, deliberately, not rushed, not heavy, just clear. "Until it is not small anymore." Ethan's shoulders shifted, the tension in his posture becoming more visible, his hands now still, no longer searching for somewhere to rest. He glanced briefly at his parents, as if looking for guidance, for a signal, but neither of them stepped in. Claire's expression had softened slightly, not into comfort, but into something more reflective, her eyes no longer avoiding the moment, while Richard's gaze remained steady, his silence now deliberate, allowing the conversation to unfold without interference. Ava looked away from Ethan then, her attention returning to the table, to the document, to the pen resting beside it, the objects that represented something structured, defined, measurable, in contrast to the intangible weight of what had just been said. "In business," she continued, her tone unchanged, "we talk about risk." She lifted her hand slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, not moving it, just acknowledging it. "Not just financial risk. Reputational, cultural, human." Each word landed with quiet precision, the list. Not dramatic, but complete. Ethan listened, his expression tightening, the connection forming more clearly now, the distance between his earlier action and this moment shrinking into something he could no longer ignore. Ava turned her head slightly, not fully facing him, but enough that her voice carried directly toward him. "How people behave when they think it does not matter," she said. "That is what defines the risk." The room seemed to settle even further into stillness, the kind that made every word feel amplified without needing volume. Claire exhaled softly, her gaze lowering for a brief moment before lifting again, her posture still composed, but no longer untouched. Richard's jaw shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in disagreement, but in recognition, as if the framework Ava was describing was one he understood, but had not expected to apply here. Not like this. Ethan swallowed again, the movement small but visible, his earlier certainty now fully replaced by something heavier, something that did not come with an easy response. He looked down at the table, at the document, at the pen, then back at Ava, his eyes no longer searching for an exit, but trying to understand the full shape of what he had stepped into. Ava's hand moved again, slowly, deliberately, her fingers closing lightly around the pen, lifting it once more from the table, the motion calm, controlled, the same as before, but the meaning behind it now different, no longer just about a signature, but about a decision that extended beyond the page. She did not lower it to the paper. She simply held it there, suspended between action and restraint, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. And then she looked at him again. The way she looked at him now was not sharp, not accusing, but it held something steadier than either, something that did not move even as the moment stretched, and Ethan felt it settle over him in a way he could not deflect or laugh away. The pen remained in her hand, suspended, unchanged, but the attention was no longer on the document, no longer on the deal, it was on him, on the space between what had happened and what he chose to do next. Ethan inhaled slowly, the air feeling heavier than before, his chest tightening just slightly as he tried to find the right words, but nothing came easily, nothing came clean. He had spoken all his life without thinking, without consequence, but now every word seemed to carry weight before it was even said. He started, then stopped, the sound fading as quickly as it had formed, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, forced to meet hers because there was nowhere else left to look. Ava did not rush him. She did not fill the silence. She did not ease the tension. She simply waited, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, allowing the moment to exist fully, without interruption. Behind him, Claire shifted her weight, her hand resting lightly against her other wrist, her composure still intact, but no longer untouched, her eyes watching Ethan now not as a mother ready to defend, but as someone witnessing a line being crossed that could not be undone. Richard stood still, his expression controlled, but his attention unwavering, the expectation in his gaze no longer implied, but present, clear, unavoidable. Ethan swallowed again, his throat dry, his mind moving through fragments of instinct, of defense, of explanation, but none of them held. "I should not have done that," he said finally, the words quiet, uneven, not polished, not practiced, but real in a way his earlier tone had not been. The room did not react immediately. There was no visible shift, no release of tension, just a subtle settling, as if something had been acknowledged but not yet resolved. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, reading not just the words, but the space behind them, the intent, the understanding, or the lack of it. "Why?" she asked softly. The question was simple, almost gentle, but it carried a depth that reached beyond the moment itself, beyond the room, beyond the night. Ethan blinked, caught off guard, his brow tightening slightly as he searched for an answer that did not come automatically. "Because it was disrespectful," he said after a pause, his voice steadier now, but still uncertain, as if he were stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Ava's gaze did not shift. "That is what it was," she said. "Not why." The distinction landed quietly, but it widened the space between them, opening something deeper than a surface apology. Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in his posture changing, no longer defensive, but exposed, uncertain. He looked down again, his reflection faint in the polished table, then back up, slower this time, more deliberate. "I did not think," he said, the words coming more carefully now, less automatic, more considered. Ava nodded once, a small acknowledgement, but not agreement, not acceptance, just recognition of the step. "That is part of it," she said. Her voice remained calm, steady, without judgment, but it did not soften the truth. "But not all of it." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his mind working, the simplicity of the moment gone, replaced by something more complex, something that required more than a quick answer. He glanced briefly at his parents again, but this time there was no expectation of rescue, only a fleeting acknowledgement before returning his attention to Ava. The room remained still, the people around them silent witnesses to something that had moved beyond business, beyond negotiation, into something more human, more difficult, more real. Ava lowered the pen slowly, not to the paper, but back toward the table, placing it carefully beside the document, aligning it once again with precise intention, the gesture quiet, controlled, final in a way that did not need to be announced. She rested her hand lightly near it, her gaze still on Ethan, her presence unchanged, but the meaning of the moment had shifted again, no longer about whether he would speak, but about whether he understood. Ethan inhaled again, deeper this time, his shoulders rising and falling as he searched for something more honest, something less immediate. "I thought it did not matter," he said finally, his voice lower, steadier, the words landing with a weight that felt closer to truth. Ava held his gaze, her expression still calm, but something in her eyes sharpened just slightly, not in judgment, but in clarity. "That," she said quietly, "is why it does." The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable. Claire's posture shifted subtly, her hands relaxing just slightly, her eyes no longer guarded but reflective, while Richard's gaze remained fixed, his expression unchanged but his attention fully engaged. Ethan stood still, the meaning of her words moving through him slowly, not resisted, not deflected, but absorbed in a way he had not expected. The earlier version of the night felt distant now, almost unreal, replaced by something quieter, heavier, more precise. Ava finally looked away, her attention returning. To the table, to the document, to the pen resting beside it, the physical center of a decision that had become something more than a transaction. And then she closed the folder. The soft sound of the folder closing was almost lost in the room, but the effect was not. It moved through the space like a quiet line drawn across everything that had been building, separating what could still happen from what already would not. Ava's hand rested lightly on top of it, her fingers still, her posture unchanged, but the decision had shifted from possibility to presence. Richard Whitmore's eyes dropped immediately to the folder, then lifted again, sharper now, the calculation returning but without the earlier certainty. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice controlled, but no longer smooth. "I assume this is not final." Ava looked at him, her gaze steady, not cold, not distant, simply clear. "It is a pause," she said, her tone even measured. "A necessary one." Claire inhaled slowly beside him, her composure still intact, but now held with intention rather than ease. "A pause," she repeated softly, as if testing the word, searching for its limits. "Before what?" Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted her hand from the folder and rested it at her side, her attention moving briefly across the room, taking in the quiet that had settled, the eyes that had gathered, the subtle shift in posture from those who understood that something significant had just occurred. When she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but it carried a weight that did not need emphasis. "Before deciding whether this is a partnership we can stand behind," she said. The phrasing was deliberate, not whether it made sense, not whether it was profitable, but whether it could be stood behind, and the distinction landed with a clarity that reshaped the moment. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers pressing against the table once more before stilling. "We have addressed the concerns," he said, his tone firm, controlled, but edged now with urgency. "Your terms are clear. We are prepared to proceed." Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without yielding to it. "The terms are not the only concern," she replied. Ethan felt the words settle in his chest before he fully understood them, the connection forming again, direct, unavoidable. He stepped forward then, not dramatically, not with confidence, but with a quiet intention that had not been there before, his movement drawing just enough attention to shift the focus back to him. "Then what is?" he asked, his voice steady but lower, stripped of anything casual, the question no longer defensive, but open. Ava looked at him, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, but something in the air between them felt more direct now, more immediate. "Consistency," she said, "between what is said and what is done." Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in his posture shifting again, no longer resisting, but absorbing. He nodded once, a small movement, not for effect, not for the room, but for himself, as if acknowledging something internally before speaking again. "I understand," he said, the words quiet, but clearer than before. Claire glanced at him, her expression softening just slightly, not into approval, but into recognition of the shift, while Richard remained still, his attention fixed, evaluating not just the deal now, but the unfolding moment as a whole. Ava watched Ethan for a second longer, then shifted her gaze back to the table, her hand moving lightly to the edge of the folder, not opening it. "Not yet. Understanding is the beginning," she said, "not the conclusion." The words were not dismissive, but they did not offer resolution either. They simply marked where he stood within it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steadying, his eyes moving briefly to the folder, then back to Ava. "Then what comes next?" he asked. The question carried no challenge, no expectation of control, only a willingness to hear the answer. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the silence settle again, not as tension, but as space, the kind that allowed something real to take shape without being rushed. Around them, the room remained still, the earlier energy completely gone, replaced by a quiet attention that felt almost respectful, as if the people present understood that they were witnessing something that extended beyond the deal itself. Ava finally moved her hand, not to open the folder, but to rest it lightly beside it, her fingers relaxed, her posture unchanged. "Time," she said simply, "to see if actions follow words." The statement did not demand anything immediate, but it removed any illusion of instant resolution, shifting the outcome into something that would be defined beyond this room, beyond this moment. Richard's expression tightened again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the implication, the lack of immediate closure, the extension of uncertainty. Claire remained composed, but her gaze lingered on Ava with a depth that suggested she understood the weight of what had been set in motion. Ethan stood still, his earlier urgency replaced by something steadier, something that did not reach for control, but accepted the absence of it. Ava's presence remained unchanged, calm, grounded, precise, as if the decision she had made was not a reaction, but a continuation of something she had always known. And then she stepped back from the table. The space she left behind at the table did not fill immediately. It lingered, open, as if the absence of her presence had weight of its own, something that could not be replaced by movement or words. Ava stepped back with the same measured calm she had carried all evening, her heels soft against the marble, her posture unchanged, but the distance she created shifted the center of the room away from the document and towards something less defined, less controllable. Richard Whitmore watched her closely, his eyes following not just her movement, but the meaning behind it, the realization settling in that the negotiation had moved beyond his reach, that control no longer belonged where he had assumed it did. Claire remained still for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the closed folder, then slowly lifted, tracking Ava as she moved away, her expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, as if recalibrating not just the situation, but her understanding of it. Ethan stood where he was, his eyes following Ava as well, but with a different weight, something more personal, more immediate, the distance between them no longer just physical, but defined by everything that had been said and everything that had not. Ava did not leave the room. She stopped a few steps away, near the edge of the gathering, where the light softened slightly and the noise of the room returned in low, cautious waves, as if people were unsure how much of the evening they were allowed to reclaim. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, hesitating just briefly near her before continuing, the subtle shift in behavior reflecting something that did not need to be announced. Ava reached for a glass this time, her fingers closing around it with quiet ease, the cool surface grounding real. She took a small sip, her gaze not fixed on any one person, but aware of the room as a whole, the way attention still lingered, the way conversations had not fully resumed. Behind her, Richard finally moved, stepping away from the table, his pace slower now, more deliberate, the absence of immediate control forcing a different kind of approach. Claire followed, her posture still composed, but her steps more measured, while Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, then exhaled and moved as well, drawn forward not by obligation, but by something he could not ignore. They approached Ava together, but not in the same formation as before. The subtle hierarchy that had once defined their movement now altered, less certain, less automatic. Richard stopped a few feet from her, leaving space that had not been there earlier, a small but significant acknowledgement. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice steady, but quieter than before. The edge of authority softened into something more measured. Ava turned her head slightly, acknowledging him without shifting her stance, her gaze calm, attentive, but not yielding. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied. Claire stepped slightly forward, her expression composed, but no longer distant. "We would like the opportunity to continue this conversation," she said, her tone careful, respectful, the phrasing chosen with intention. Ava considered her for a brief moment, not dismissing, not accepting, simply weighing the request as it was presented. "You have that opportunity," she said. "It is ongoing." The answer did not close the door, but it did not open it either. It simply defined the space between them. Ethan stepped forward then, his movement slower, more deliberate, his posture no longer relaxed, but grounded, as if he were choosing each step rather than moving out of habit. He stopped just slightly behind his parents, then shifted, stepping to the side so that he faced Ava more directly, not hiding behind them, not deferring entirely. "I meant what I said," he said, his voice steady, not loud, not performative, but clear. Ava looked at him, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. "Which part?" she asked, her tone calm, not challenging, but precise. Ethan did not hesitate this time, though his breath slowed slightly before he spoke. That I should not have done it, he said, and that I understand why it matters. The words were simple, but they carried a different weight now, less about correcting the moment and more about acknowledging its impact. Ava held his gaze for a second longer, her eyes steady, searching not for perfection, but for alignment between what he said and what he showed. The room around them remained quiet, the earlier energy replaced by something more attentive, more restrained, as if everyone present understood that this moment could not be rushed or forced. Ava nodded once, a small, measured acknowledgement, not acceptance, not resolution, but recognition. Then show it, she said. The words were quiet, but they landed with clarity, shifting the responsibility forward, beyond the conversation, beyond the room. Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance, the weight of what she had said settling into something he could not ignore. He nodded once in return, not out of habit, but with intention. Richard and Claire exchanged a brief glance, something unspoken passing between them, their earlier certainty replaced by a more complex understanding of what it would take to move forward. Ava lifted the glass slightly, taking another small sip, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if the moment had not unsettled her, but simply revealed what had always been there. And then she turned slightly, as if preparing to leave them where they stood. She did not rush the turn, did not make it abrupt or final, just a slight shift of her shoulders, a subtle redirection of her body that suggested movement without fully committing to it, and somehow that made it feel more decisive than if she had walked away immediately. The glass remained in her hand, the condensation gathering along its surface, catching the light in small reflections that moved as she did, quiet details in a moment that no longer needed to prove anything. Ethan noticed the change before anyone else spoke, the way her attention began to withdraw, not in dismissal, but in completion, as if she had already given everything that was necessary and anything more would be excess. He stepped forward again, not quickly, not urgently, but with intention, closing just enough distance to keep the moment from slipping away entirely. Wait, he said, the words softer than expected, not a demand, not a command, just a request that carried weight because of how carefully it was used. Ava paused, not turning back immediately, her posture still, her head angled slightly, as if considering whether the moment required more. Richard and Claire remained silent behind him, their presence no longer leading, but observing, allowing something else to take shape without interference. Ava turned then, slowly, her gaze returning to Ethan, calm, steady, unchanged, but attentive. Yes, she said. The simplicity of the response left no room for performance, no space to hide behind rehearsed language or polished tone. Ethan inhaled, his breath measured, his shoulders steadying as he met her eyes, not looking away this time, not searching for an easier angle. You said to show it, he began, his voice even, each word placed with care. I do not expect that to happen in one conversation. Ava watched him, her expression neutral, but engaged, allowing him to continue without interruption. But I can start now, he said. The statement was not dramatic, not loud, but it carried something new, something grounded, something that did not ask for recognition, only for the chance to exist. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of the effort to step forward. How? She asked, her tone calm, direct, leaving the responsibility entirely with him. Ethan did not answer immediately. He glanced briefly around the room, taking in the people who were still watching, the quiet attention that had not faded, then back at Ava. By not pretending it was nothing, he said. By not hiding behind what I meant or did not mean. His voice remained steady, not defensive, not searching for validation, but stating something he had only just begun to understand. Claire's expression softened further, the tension in her posture easing slightly as she listened, while Richard remained still, his gaze fixed, evaluating not the words alone, but the consistency behind them. Ava's eyes remained on Ethan, steady, measured, reading not just what he said, but how he stood, how he held himself in the absence of control. And after this room? She asked. The question extended the moment beyond the present, beyond the audience, into something less visible, less immediate. Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his posture settling into something more natural, less forced. "The same," he said, "especially when no one is watching." The answer did not come quickly, but it came clean, without excess, without performance. Ava nodded. Once more, a small movement, but this time it carried a different weight, not acceptance, not resolution, but recognition of direction. The room remained quiet, the earlier tension now replaced by something steadier, something that did not need to be resolved in a single moment. Ava shifted her weight slightly, the glass still in her hand, her posture relaxed but precise. "Then we will see," she said. The words were simple, but they held space rather than closing it, allowing what came next to be defined by action rather than promise. Richard stepped forward then, just slightly, his voice measured, controlled, but no longer carrying the same edge of authority. "We are willing to earn that," he said, the phrasing deliberate, acknowledging what had changed without fully stating it. Claire inclined her head subtly beside him, her expression composed, but aligned. Ava looked at them briefly, then back at Ethan, her gaze steady, grounded, the center of the moment returning once more to the place where it had shifted. She lifted the glass slightly, finishing the last small sip, then lowered it, placing it carefully on a nearby tray as a server passed by, the gesture quiet, precise, complete. Her hands were now free, at her sides, her posture unchanged, her presence calm. She looked once more at the three of them, not as opponents, not as partners, but as people standing in a moment that would define what came next. And then, without another word, she began to walk away again, this time not pausing. The sound of her heels faded slowly into the distance, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, each step measured, controlled, as if the floor itself had aligned to her rhythm. And for a moment, no one moved to follow, no one called her back, because something about the way she left made it clear that the moment had already said everything it needed to. The room did not return to what it had been before. The laughter did not come back the same way. The music continued, but it felt different now, softer, almost distant, as if it no longer defined the space. Conversations resumed in low tones, careful, measured, shaped by what had just unfolded, by what could no longer be unseen. Ethan stood where he was, his eyes still fixed in the direction Ava had walked, even after she had moved beyond the edge of the gathering, beyond the center of attention, into something quieter, something that did not need to be watched to be understood. His hands rested at his sides, still, no longer searching, no longer restless, his posture grounded in a way that felt unfamiliar but real. Claire exhaled slowly beside him, her shoulders lowering slightly, the tension easing but not disappearing, her gaze following Ava as well, though with a different expression now, one that carried thought rather than assumption. Richard remained still for a moment longer, his eyes shifting from the direction Ava had gone back to the table, to the closed folder, to the pen resting beside it, the physical remains of a decision that had not been made, but had already changed everything. He stepped forward then, not with urgency, but with intention, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface as if grounding himself in something that had not shifted, even though everything else had. He looked at the folder, then at Ethan, his expression controlled, but quieter, less certain, as if the outcome he had expected no longer fit the reality in front of him. "We have work to do," he said, his voice low, not directed as a command, but as a statement that acknowledged what had been revealed. Ethan nodded slightly, the movement small, but deliberate, his eyes finally lowering from where Ava had disappeared to the table, to the folder, to the space where the pen had been lifted and set down again without a signature. "I know," he said, his voice steady, not defensive, not dismissive, just clear. Claire glanced between them, her expression softening just slightly, not into comfort, but into alignment, as if something had shifted not only in the situation, but in the way they understood it together. Around them, the room slowly reclaimed itself, but not completely, not fully, the earlier ease replaced by something more aware, more intentional, as if everyone present had witnessed a moment that quietly reset the boundaries of what mattered. Near the edge of the room, the young server stood still for a second longer, her eyes following the direction Ava had gone, then lowering as she adjusted the tray in her hands, her posture straightening just slightly, something subtle but meaningful settling into place. The table remained where it was, unchanged, the documents still closed, the pen still aligned, waiting not for a decision made in haste, but for one that would come from something deeper than agreement. Ethan stepped closer to it, his hand hovering briefly over the folder, not opening it, not touching it, just acknowledging it in a way that felt different from before, as if he understood now that what it represented extended far beyond the numbers inside. He withdrew his hand, his gaze lifting again, not searching for Ava this time, but carrying something of her presence with him, something that did not leave when she did. Across the room, the doors opened quietly as guests moved in and out, the night continuing, the city beyond still alive, still moving, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside these walls. Ava walked through that space without looking back, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, the light from the hallway catching briefly along the edge of her silhouette before she moved beyond it, into something quieter, something that did not need to be seen to matter. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded anything. She had not needed to prove who she was. And yet, the room she left behind no longer felt the same. Ethan stood still for a moment longer, then inhaled slowly, his breath steadying, his shoulders settling into something that felt less like certainty and more like awareness. He glanced once more at the table, then at his parents, then toward the space where Ava had disappeared, the weight of the night no longer something he could ignore, but something he would have to carry forward, not as a burden, but as a measure. And somewhere beyond the room, beyond the contracts and the conversations, beyond the expectations that had shaped the night, a different kind of decision was already beginning to take form.